Welcome to Native Report. I'm Stacey Thunder. The treaty-making era between the United States and Native nations resulted in hundreds of formal documents. Yet, there are many who question why these treaties still exist. In Minnesota, an exhibit attempts to answer the question, and why treaties matter.
On this summer day, visitors to the Bois Forte Heritage Center are viewing Why Treaties Matter, one of two traveling exhibits exploring treaties signed between the Native nations in Minnesota and the federal government.
The idea developed out of a conversation at a previous Minnesota Indian Affairs Council meeting in which we had a meeting with the National Museum of the American Indian, and Kevin Gover was present, as well as some of his staff. And we talked about how do we get the message out about understanding sovereignty and Indian tribes. And we had to look at the foundation of the relationship and the sovereign status between governments and tribes was the treaties that were signed between the United States of America and the individual sovereign Indian nations. And so we wanted to go to the foundation of that, and we talked about the treaty exhibit, and fortunately we're at where we are today. I think people have to understand that if we respect the U.S. Constitution, Section 1, Article 8 of the U.S. Constitution states in there that sovereign nations are other governments, the U.S. governments, the individual states, and Indian nations. So it's very important that that treaty specifically recognizes the U.S. Constitution, and the U.S. Constitution also spells that out. So treaties are alive today, and it was the sole purpose of these treaties to allow the governments who are here first, which are Indian nations, and who have always governed themselves, it respects that relationship.
In addition to the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, of which Chairman Leecy is also president, and the National Museum of the American Indian, the Minnesota Humanities Center is a third partner in an exhibit unique in its community-based approach.
The Why Treaties Matter exhibit, boy, it really started with the legacy funding out of the state of Minnesota, which is a constitutional amendment which specifies a certain amount of arts and cultural funding each year. So the Humanities Center of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council received funding to create collaborative programming, new programming that would serve the state. And it was really the vision of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Board and Chairman Leecy to do something referential with this, do something that had really never been done before.
It took quite a while. It took about a year to put together. We collaborated with the various Indian nations in Minnesota and researched some of the individual, because tribes are also individual governments, and the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council is just a council represented by Indian nations. So we want to get the individual story because they're sovereign, distinct governments. So we want to get the individual story, put it in a collective, and get the overall theme of treaties and the sovereignty of Indian nations in there.
We being the program team that really pulled this together. The program team was made up, I had the honor of serving on it, and then there were staff from Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, staff from the National Museum, and we made, if we totaled it up, 35 to 40 visits to the 11 sovereign nations of Minnesota. First, we're exploratory. Second, we might have gotten more information from a tribal elder or knowledge keeper. And then the third visit, on average, we actually looked at the text that was being written. So a lot of information is collected and then sent to the writers and editors who the National Museum really put the panels together. And it was important, I think, the board and the staff at the Humanities Center and the program team, and certainly the Indian Affairs Council, wanted all the nations to feel like they were represented and their voice could be heard. And that's not necessarily an easy task when you only have 20 panels and 200 words.
More than 17,000 Minnesotans in 34 counties experienced the exhibit, which received an award from the Federation of State Humanities Councils.
We have 2 traveling exhibits that travel all over the state of Minnesota, and we represent the treaty exhibit at different, not only tribal governments, but also individuals, nonprofits, other museums, and as well as the state capitol, the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, just so people have a better understanding of the treaties themselves.
Generally speaking, the feedback we've gotten from both Dakota and Ojibwe and tribes across Minnesota has been really strong. I think there are at least two audiences for this. For the, if you will, the non-enrolled member, or just a Minnesotan who's not enrolled in one of the nations, almost feeling ripped off. Like, why didn't anybody tell me? I had no idea about this nation-to-nation relationship. No one told me about the nations prior to U.S. If you will, settlement and U.S. conquering of this land. That there were nations here prior to that, and that their exercise of sovereignty has been consistent from the beginning of time in this place. So I think, one, why didn't anybody tell me? It would have been nice to know. And for enrolled members, I think particularly students, I know this is where we've heard a lot from the Indian Affairs Board. We want our students to understand these rights, what we had to do to secure these rights and reserve these rights, and that our future is based on the proper exercise of these rights.
The exhibit may come full circle with a possible showing at the National Museum of the American Indian.
We're looking at plans to have the exhibit actually travel to Washington, D.C., to the National Museum of the American Indian. And there may be an opportunity for this to be showcased there, as well as maybe even looking at a national exhibit on Indian treaties. We're really excited about this exhibit that travels all over the state of Minnesota to create a better understanding between Indians and non-Indians, and to, hopefully open up a new dialogue here in Minnesota with respect to one another.